Thank you very much, Chair. As most fishing quota is owned by just a handful of companies, small inshore fishers actually don't really gain anything from leaving the CFP, but yet they will actually face increased bureaucracy, tariffs, just exactly like Norway, and also possibly shipping delays, which could increase their costs and decrease their value. So what support is the government going to give to the inshore small boat fishing industry?
Well, the DEFRA Secretary of State has been clear that additional quota that we can secure as a result of taking back control of that sovereign resource will be allocated more to smaller boats.
But only on a very fractional basis. I mean, there's still a plan that actually additional quota will follow previous quota and still end up largely in the hands of the handful of big companies across the UK.
Well, there is precedent for the reallocation of existing quota. Richard Benyon, when he was Fisheries Minister, was able to make some significant advance there. But it will be the case that essentially the more access to the more resource we have, the more quota will go to smaller boats and to precisely the sorts of communities which you are understandably concerned to see prosper and benefit.
Indeed I am, because it's in my constituency. But the UK has always had the power to reform quota. So why did the government never in the past look at reforming quota and allocating it to areas? On the west coast where I am, a lot of the quota ended up bought up by the northeast of Scotland, and all of our fishing industry is basically shellfish.
Well, I'd say two things. The first thing there is that Richard Benyon, I mentioned earlier, did establish that you can reallocate quota, and quota has been reallocated in certain circumstances. And there is more that we can do. You're absolutely right. But I wouldn't want for a moment to take away from the success of the fisheries sector in the North East, and also the additional potential for growth that exists as a result of our departure. And the Scottish Government's produced helpful economic modelling. I mentioned to the Chairman earlier that not all economic modelling necessarily is an accurate predictor of what will happen in the future, but the Scottish Government have indicated that there will be additional jobs and income as a result of leaving the CFP.
I don't begrudge any success to the North East, but you must recognise that on the west coast and the islands, it's the small boat industry that is utterly critical to coastal communities. Now, in my constituency, in Ayrshire, looking across at Northern Ireland, we already have boats that are talking about registering in Northern Ireland so they can land there straight into the single market. Does he recognise what that would do to the onshore industry of harbours, markets and processing?
Yes, I do appreciate that, but I'm sure that we'll be able, through the working of the Joint Committee and through the eventual arrangements that we reach with the EU, I'm sure that we won't be in a position where fishermen on the West Coast have to contemplate landing their catch anywhere other than where they land it at the moment.
But obviously the Joint Committee will only be looking at Northern Ireland, so is he proposing that they may forbid fishermen from elsewhere to re-register their boats?
No, but I think that I hope that at the conclusion of the talks that there will be no reason for people to contemplate making that change.
In the future relationship paper, it talks about recognising the interests of the devolved governments in agriculture and fishing, and particularly in fishing, commits to work with them. Exactly how will that happen? Because up till now, the devolved governments have felt they've been able to turn up here and be talked at, but that they've not particularly been listened to. So what will be different now around fishing?
Well, before I did this job, I was DEFRA Secretary, and we had, and I inherited a practice whereby most months the relevant ministers from the UK, Wales and Scotland, and now of course the Northern Ireland Executive has been restored, Northern Ireland ministers as well, would meet to discuss issues of common interest, particularly with respect to the EU negotiations. And there were a number of very useful practical suggestions that were made at different points by Fergus Ewing and Leslie Griffiths and others. One particular point that Fergus made was about the importance of seeing if we could prioritise fresh fish and shellfish in certain circumstances. And we have explored that. George Eustace, when he was Minister of State, did some work on that. It may be in the future that we need to do that. It's also the case that, partly as a result of the input from the Scottish Government, that in our talks with the EU and the points that we were making, a recognition was made by the French that they should have a border inspection post for fish at Boulogne at the fish market rather than at Calais. So that's just one area. More broadly, Mike Russell, on behalf of the Scottish Government, has made a number of suggestions about how we can involve the devolved administrations in negotiations, which have informed our approach. Now, you'll appreciate Mike is a very robust guy, and there are aspects of what we're doing with which he profoundly disagrees, but nevertheless, it's the case that he lands arguments well, and those arguments do weigh with us.
And do you recognise that among the industries themselves, among the NFU in Scotland and also the fishing representatives, there's great concern about the idea of the overarching frameworks being decided at Westminster for an industry in Scotland that is so different and yet represents the majority of fishing in the UK?
I think that it's important that we do have common frameworks in order to ensure that the UK's internal market works well, and that we don't, for example, have different animal health rules in Scotland from England. But it is also the case that fisheries protection, for example, the Scottish Government is in charge of. The subsidy or support regime for agriculture, the Scottish Government is in charge of. So I think devolution works, but we always keep, as a UK government, the situation, our relationship with the devolved administrations in a way which allows us, if it is the case that the Scottish or the Welsh or the Northern Ireland executive feel that the shoe is pinching too tightly in any particular area, we're always open to trying to do what we can